All right, so today we're diving deep into red flags. Why Xi's China is in jeopardy.
Oh, yeah, this one by George Magnus, right?
Exactly. It's all about, well, the economic and political challenges that China's facing right now under Xi Jinping.
Lots to unpack there.
For sure. We'll try to hit the key points and really dig into what Magnus calls these traps, these things that could, seriously threaten China's economic success going forward.
Sounds good. I'm ready.
Okay, so Magnus uses this phrase. He says, China risks getting old before getting rich.
Yeah, what a phrase,
It
right?
really makes you think. So what does that actually mean, like, for a country?
Basically, their population's aging super fast, way faster than their income is growing. Think tons more retirees before they hit that level of wealth we see in developed nations.
Huh. So a big shift in demographics before they've really secured, like, widespread prosperity.
Right, and that can throw a real wrench in their plans for growth. Could even lead to some social instability.
That makes sense. And to really understand where this anxiety is coming from, Magnus takes us back to what he calls the century of humiliation.
Yeah.
This period between 1839 and 1949, it's like this ghost hanging over China's relationship with the West, even today.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. China was basically carved up by foreign powers during that time, exploited left and right.
So it's no wonder they're, well, a little suspicious of the West.
Right, like they see this long history of being taken advantage of. But at the same time, they know that engagement with those same powers was crucial for their economic boom.
So it's like this balancing act they're trying to pull off.
Totally. Pushing back against the West while also recognizing they need to work with them. It's fascinating, really.
It is, and Magnus uses this crazy anecdote to illustrate this tension. It's about Lord Macartney, who, back in 1793, he tried to open up Chinese ports to British trade.
Oh, yeah. I
Yeah.
remember that one. He came bearing all these fancy gifts, right? Clocks, scientific instruments, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. But the Chinese emperor was basically like, nah, we're good. We don't need your stuff.
Such a classic example of China, historically, just resisting outside influence. They thought they had everything they needed.
Wow. Talk about a clash of cultures. Okay, so we've got this backdrop of historical tension. Then Magnus dives into Mao Zedong and his economic legacy.
Yeah, a mixed bag, to say the least.
For sure. On one hand, he pushed for industrialization, tried to modernize China.
But then you've got the Great Leap Forward.
Ah, right, which was supposed to, like, catapult them into this new economic era.
But instead it led to this horrific famine, set the country back decades, really shows how good intentions can go totally off the rails.
Absolutely. Okay, so then we get to Deng Xiaoping, who famously said, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat.
I love that quote.
It's so pragmatic, right? And that's basically what he did. He threw out the old rule book, opened up China to the world.
Deng's reforms were huge. I mean, think about it. New ideas started flowing in from all over.
Like from where?
Well, for one, they created the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, specifically to encourage new thinking about the economy. They also started working directly with Western economists.
Really?
Yeah, people like Janos Kornai, who introduced this idea of hard budget constraints. Companies actually had to perform or they'd go under.
So no more, like, free rides for state-owned enterprises.
Exactly. It was a massive shift. And after 1978, boom, productivity explodes across pretty much every sector. You can draw a straight line between Deng's reforms and China's economic miracle.
Okay, so Deng sets the stage, things are looking up. But then Magnus throws a curveball. He says, hang on, even with all this progress, there are some serious traps lurking out there that could derail China's future.
The four traps, right?
Yep. He lays out four big ones. The debt trap, the renminbi trap, the aging trap, and the middle income trap.
Kind of reminds me of the Indiana Jones dodging booby traps, you know?
That's a great analogy. Okay, let's break these down one by one. First up, the debt trap. What's the deal with that?
Well, Magnus basically says China's been on this massive borrowing spree fueled by tons of investments and this, like, over-reliance on credit.
How bad is it, really?
Pretty bad, actually. They accounted for almost half of all new credit created globally between 2005 and 2016.
Whoa, half!
Yeah. So the big question is, what happens if this whole house of cards comes crashing down?
Right, because it's like you can build a fancy skyscraper, but if it's on shaky foundations.
Exactly. And that's the worry. If this debt bubble bursts, we could be looking at a global financial crisis. Think banks collapsing, businesses shutting down, stock markets tanking.
So this isn't just a China problem. It would ripple out and affect everyone.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And then there's this whole other layer of risk with shadow banking.
Shadow banking, that sounds kind of ominous.
It is. It's basically all this lending that's happening outside of traditional banks, often with very little oversight. Super risky stuff, makes the entire financial system a lot more vulnerable.
So are they doing anything to try and address this, or are they just kind of ignoring the problem?
Well, they're not ignoring it completely. The government knows it's a risk, and they started taking some steps to, deleverage, try to reduce the amount of debt in the system.
But that's got to be tricky, right?
Super tricky. It's this delicate balancing act. If they tighten things too quickly, they could trigger a recession, which could then lead to social unrest.
So they're trying to defuse a bomb, basically. Okay, so that's the debt trap. What about this renminbi trap?
Right. Sounds mysterious, doesn't it?
It does, like something out of Harry Potter.
Uh-huh. Right.
Right.
But it's actually all about managing China's currency. They want a stable renminbi, which helps with trade and investment, but they also want to control how capital flows in and out of the country.
I can see how that would be tough, like trying to have your cake and eat it too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Magnus brings up this great example, the stock market crash of 2015. The government tried to intervene, tried to control the market, but they actually ended up making things worse. Yeah. Led to this huge devaluation of the renminbi, and a bunch of investors pulled their money out of China, scared of more instability.
Oh, wow. So it backfired on them.
Big time. It really shows how hard it is to manage a currency in today's globalized world.
All right, on to trap number 3, the aging trap. This one's a problem for lots of countries, not just China, right?
Totally. It's a global issue. But in China, it's happening at warp speed. Magnus opens this section with this story about Rudong County where, get this, half the population is over 60.
Seriously? Half?
Yeah, it's wild. They get a glimpse into China's future. A rapidly aging population with fewer and fewer young people to support them.
So their whole model of like a massive low-cost workforce, it's just not going to work anymore.
Nope. They're going to have to find ways to boost productivity, maybe through automation and technology. But even then, who's going to take care of all these elderly folks? The cost of healthcare, pensions, Social Security, it's all going to skyrocket. Yikes. Sounds like a real demographic time bomb.
Yeah.
Okay, last trap. The middle income trap. This one sounds a bit technical, but I bet it's more relevant than we think.
Oh, it totally is. It's this idea that countries can reach a certain level of income, but then they get stuck. They struggle to break through to become truly wealthy.
Okay, so how do they avoid getting stuck?
Well, Magnus uses this really interesting example to illustrate this. It's about Nogales, a city that's literally split in half by the U.S.-Mexico border.
Oh, I've heard of that. Same geography, same people, but totally different economic realities, right?
Exactly. And Magnus says the key difference is institutions.
Institutions.
Yeah, like the rules of the game. The U.S. side of Nogales has strong institutions. Property rights, reliable courts, fair competition. The Mexican side struggles with weaker institutions, corruption, a lack of economic freedom. It shows that money isn't enough. You need a solid framework to support long-term growth.
It's like having a Ferrari, but no roads to drive it on. Perfect analogy. And this is where it gets interesting for China. They've had incredible growth, but their institutions are still, relatively weak, especially compared to developed countries.
So they're kind of like driving that Ferrari on a dirt road.
In a way, yeah. Magnus argues that if they want to avoid getting stuck in this middle-income trap, they need to move beyond cheap manufacturing and embrace innovation, tech advancements, and maybe even some institutional reforms. They need to build those roads.
So it's about moving from made in China to innovated in China.
Exactly. But that's a huge leap, and it's not clear if they're ready or willing to make it.
This is all super fascinating stuff. But Magnus doesn't stop there. He also delves into China's massive Belt and Road Initiative, basically, a modern-day Silk Road spanning continents. What's the deal with this project?
Oh yeah, it's an ambitious one for sure. Magnus actually starts this section with this anecdote about a freight train traveling all the way from Yiwu in China to London in England.
Wow, seriously?
Yeah. It just shows how vast this project is. But it's not just about building roads and bridges. It's about expanding China's influence, both economically and geopolitically.
So they're literally paving the way for a new world order.
Well, in a way, yeah. They want to boost their construction and manufacturing industries, sure. But they're also trying to spread their model of development, their way of doing things.
And that's making some countries nervous.
You bet. The U.S., India, Japan, they're all watching very closely, worried about China's growing power and potential for, conflicts over resources and influence.
It's like this global game of risk with China making some pretty bold moves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about economic competition or who controls the South China Sea.
It's about two very different visions of the world clashing.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be digging into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look more closely at Xi Jinping's leadership and explore those potential flashpoints between China and the West.
Sounds good. Can't wait.
Me neither. It's going to be a wild ride.
Well, that's it for part 1 of our deep dive into red flags. We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's so much more to explore.
For sure. And we'll be back soon to tackle those big questions about China's future and its role in the world.
So stay tuned. We'll see you in part 2.
See you then. Picking up where we left off, Xi Jinping, he's really consolidated his power in a way we haven't seen, in decades in China.
Yeah, Magnus makes that point pretty clearly.
He does. And one of the examples he gives is this thing called the National Supervision Commission.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one. What is it exactly?
So basically, it puts all public servants, not just party members, under the party's watch.
So everyone's accountable to the party, no matter what.
Exactly. And it's not just about who's in charge. It's about making sure everyone toes the party line, ideologically speaking.
Huh. Interesting. So it's like less room for dissent, less room for different viewpoints.
Exactly. And Magnus also points out how the party's been, streamlining its structure, merging different government bodies, centralizing control.
So it's a very top-down approach.
Very much so.
Right.
A far cry from, the more consensus-driven style of some previous leaders.
And this raises a big question for me. Can this kind of system, one that really prizes control above all else, can it actually deal with the massive challenges China's facing?
Right. How do you foster real innovation when everyone's afraid to step out of line?
Exactly.
It's a tough one. Magnus doesn't have a simple answer, but he does say that China needs to find some kind of balance.
A balance between...
the party's desire for control and the need for more economic freedom, more openness if they want to keep growing.
Because without that freedom, it's hard to see how they escape that middle income trap we talked about earlier.
Totally agree. Now, shifting gears a bit, Magnus spends a good chunk of the book talking about technology, and this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, how so?
Well, China's making a huge bet on tech. They're pouring resources into becoming a global leader in, everything. AI, big data, robotics, you name it.
So they're going all in on the tech revolution.
Big time. But they're doing it their own way. It's a very state-driven model.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the government picks winners and losers, guides investment, controls research. It's like made in China 2025, but on steroids.
So it's not just about catching up anymore. They want to be the ones setting the pace.
Exactly. But Magnus points out it's not going to be easy. They've got a shortage of skilled workers. They have weak intellectual property protection. And, there's still this culture that often favors imitation over real groundbreaking innovation.
Right. Those are some serious hurdles.
They are. And then, of course, there's that tension again. Can you force innovation in a system that's so tightly controlled?
It's like they're trying to have it both ways.
It really is. Magnus calls it a grand experiment, and honestly, nobody knows how it's going to turn out. But the results, they're going to have huge implications, not just for China, but for the whole world.
No pressure then.
Well,
Okay, let's bring it back to something we touched on earlier. The potential for social unrest in China.
Right, that's a big one.
Yeah, if things start going south economically, could that be a tipping point?
Magnus seems to think so. He links the potential for unrest to things like rising inequality, environmental problems, and this kind of growing sense of disillusionment among certain segments of the population.
Because if you're being promised prosperity, a better life, and those promises aren't being kept.
People get restless. And it happens everywhere, not just China.
Totally. And it's not just about economics either, right? You mentioned environmental problems.
Yeah, pollution, overdevelopment, just this feeling that things are spiraling out of control, that can create a real powder keg.
So they're juggling a lot of different challenges here.
They are. And if even one of those balls they're juggling drops,
Yeah.
the consequences could be huge.
Okay, so we've talked about these traps, the power plays, the tech ambitions, and the social pressures. As we wrap up this part, what's the big takeaway about China's future? Where does Magnus leave us?
He's definitely not sugarcoating things. He lays out all these potential pitfalls, the risks, the challenges. But, he also reminds us that China has this incredible track record of overcoming obstacles.
Like, they've defied the odds before.
Exactly. Think about it. They went from an impoverished nation to an economic superpower in just a few decades.
It's pretty remarkable when you put it like that.
It is, and that's why, even with all these red flags, Magnus doesn't write them off. He leaves us with this really thought-provoking question. Could China's embrace of state-driven technology, especially their social credit system, actually be a path to success?
The social credit system, that's the one where they track people's behavior, give them scores, right?
That's the one. And it's controversial, for sure, raises all sorts of ethical questions about privacy, freedom, control. But Magnus asks, could this be their secret weapon? Could it somehow lead to a different kind of economic prosperity, one built on control rather than freedom?
That's a mind-blowing question.
It is. And it really challenges our assumptions about how technology and society, should interact.
It makes you think, that's for sure.
It does. And as we head into the final part of this deep dive, we're going to explore some of the implications of that question. We'll delve deeper into China's relationship with the West and the potential for, serious conflict in the 21st century.
Okay, so more to come. Can't wait. So we've been talking about China maybe using tech, especially this social credit system, to kind of forge their own path, maybe even rewrite the rules as they go.
Yeah, it's a pretty radical idea.
It is, right. But is that really what Magnus is suggesting?
I think so. He acknowledges that it's controversial, even disturbing to some people.
For sure.
But he's also pushing us to consider, what if it actually works? What if they pull it off?
What if economic success doesn't have to be tied to individual freedom the way, we in the West have always assumed?
Right, exactly. What if China's proving that wrong? It's a pretty fundamental challenge to, our whole way of thinking about these things.
It is. Makes you wonder what we'd be willing to give up, in exchange for economic security. Are privacy and freedom really on the table?
Tough questions. No easy answers.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't just ignore them, especially with China's influence growing the way it is.
And speaking of that growing influence, Magnus definitely doesn't shy away from talking about the potential for conflict, right?
No way.
Especially between China and the West.
Nope, not at all. And he argues that it's not just about, who controls the South China Sea or who's got the bigger economy.
It's about something bigger, isn't it?
Way bigger. He's talking about two fundamentally different visions of the world, two sets of values that are on a collision course.
Democracy versus authoritarianism. Individual freedom versus state control.
Exactly. The classic battle of ideologies. And those differences, they're not going away anytime soon.
So how does this play out? Where are we headed?
Well, Magnus suggests that we're entering a new era of, great power competition.
Okay, so a new Cold War.
Maybe. But even more complex. Because it's not just about military might or who's got the most nukes. It's about who shapes the global order. Who sets the rules? Who gets to define what success even looks like?
So it's a battle for, hearts and minds as much as anything else.
Totally. And China's playing that game hard. Think about the Belt and Road Initiative, right? It's not just about infrastructure. It's about spreading their model, their influence.
It's like a charm offensive, but on a global scale.
Exactly. But it's making a lot of folks nervous.
Ooh.
And Magnus, he leaves us with this kind of chilling thought. What if China's model actually wins? What if their version of, authoritarian capitalism, with its emphasis on state control and limited freedoms, becomes the dominant force in the 21st century?
It's a scary thought, honestly.
It is. But we can't just pretend it's not a possibility. We need to understand China's ambitions, their strengths, their weaknesses, and the potential consequences of their rise.
So knowledge is power, I guess.
Absolutely. And that's really what this whole deep dive has been about.
Giving people the tools to, understand this increasingly complex world.
Exactly, so they can make their own informed decisions.
Well said. Well, that's it for our deep dive into red flags, why Xi's China is in jeopardy.
It's been a journey.
Yes. From the century of humiliation to the debt trap to this whole idea of a new world order. Lots to think about.
Definitely. Hope folks found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe, a little bit unsettling too.
If you're intrigued by what you've heard, we highly recommend checking out the book. It's a real eye-opener.
For sure. And remember, keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and most importantly, keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.
See you then.